He was 5 feet 6 inches tall. He weighed 120 pounds. He came from a tobacco farm in Kentucky, and on the morning of January 24th, 1945, 6 German tanks and 600 German soldiers were walking through the snow toward his battalion, and he was the only American who could stop them. He picked up a telephone. He walked 400 yards into the open. He lay down in a ditch 18 inches deep, and 3 hours later, when the Germans had closed to within 10 yards of his position, he called American artillery fire down onto his own body. 12 shells, 5 yards from where he lay. His name was Garlin Murl Conner. The United States Army would need 73 years to admit what he did that morning. By the time they finally said it out loud, he had been dead for 20 years. The story of how that medal reached his widow's hand begins in a hollow in eastern Kentucky, 100 years earlier. The Arran post office served a stretch of farmland along Indian Creek, a tributary of the Cumberland River. There was no town to speak of, just families and crops and mules and a one-room schoolhouse 15 miles from the Conner place. Garlin Murl Conner was born there on the 2nd of June, 1919, the third of 11 children. His father rented the land they worked. They grew tobacco and corn. They lit kerosene lamps. They carried water from the spring. Garlin finished the 8th grade. That was the end of his schooling. He went to work in the fields beside his father and his brothers. He was small even for the hills. He grew to 5 feet and 6 inches and stopped there. He never weighed more than 120 pounds. He was quiet. He listened more than he spoke. He had a slow Kentucky drawl that people found gentle. In March of 1941, he walked into a recruiting office and signed his name. He was 21 years old. This is the first thing the official record gets wrong by accident. Most accounts treat Garlin Conner as a soldier of the Second World War. He was not yet. When he enlisted, there was no war for America. Pearl Harbor would not happen for another 9 months. France had fallen the previous summer. Britain stood alone. Most American boys his age were waiting to see what would happen. Garlin Conner did not wait. 4 of his brothers would follow him into uniform. Their mother would spend the next 4 years writing letters to 5 fronts at once. The Army assigned him to the 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division, the Marne Division. He shipped to North Africa in late 1942 and went ashore at Fedala in Morocco. He fought through Sicily in the summer of '43. He fought up the Italian Boot. He fought at Salerno. By October of that year, he was a communications sergeant, stringing wire under fire, and during one heavy German counterattack, he left a covered position and ran into a gap in the American line. He pulled wounded men under cover. He organized fire. He held the gap until reinforcements came. That action earned him his first Silver Star. It would not be his last, or his second, or his third. The Army would eventually award him 4 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, the French Croix de Guerre, and the Distinguished Service Cross. He would be wounded 7 times. He would earn 3 Purple Hearts. By the time the war ended in Europe, Sergeant Conner, by then First Lieutenant Conner, would be among the most decorated American soldiers of the entire conflict. He never mentioned any of it. On the 22nd of January, 1944, the 3rd Division stepped ashore at Anzio. Garlin Conner stepped ashore with them. The Anzio beachhead became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the European War. For 4 months, the Germans held the high ground. They shelled the beachhead day and night. There was nowhere on Anzio that was safe. Men slept in graves they had dug for themselves and called them foxholes. On the 31st of January, 9 days into the battle, a young private named Gordon W. Roberts took a wound that would not stop bleeding. Roberts was from Wisconsin. He was 23 years old. He was Garlin Conner's friend. Conner carried him on his back to a battalion aid station. He stayed with Roberts when the medics worked. He stayed when the medics stopped working. He held him until he died. Remember this name? Gordon W. Roberts. It matters at the end of the story. After Anzio, Garlin fought up through Italy and then turned west. In August of 1944, he came ashore again. this time on the beaches of southern France during Operation Dragoon. He fought through the Vosges Mountains into Alsace. He earned a battlefield commission. The communications sergeant became a second lieutenant and then a first lieutenant. By the autumn of '44, he was 25 years old and had fought in 8 separate combat campaigns of the 3rd Infantry Division. Then, somewhere in the Vosges, a German sniper put a bullet through his left hip. It went deep, it tore muscle. It bled and bled. He was carried back to a field hospital behind the lines. The doctors cleaned the wound. They told him he was finished with combat for a while. He needed weeks of recovery, maybe months. He had earned the rest, they said. He had earned more rest than the army could give him. Garlin Conner waited 2 days in that hospital bed. On the 3rd day, he got dressed. He walked out the door. He hitched rides on supply trucks heading east, back toward the front, back toward the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry Regiment, back toward the men he had left behind in the snow. The hospital papers listed him as absent without leave. He rejoined his unit 48 hours before the morning of January 24th, 1945. To understand what he was walking into, you have to understand the map. By the winter of 1944, the Allied armies had pushed the Germans almost all the way back to the Rhine. Almost. Around the city of Colmar in the Alsace region of eastern France, a German salient still bulged westward across the river. 850 square miles of forest and farmland and snow-covered villages, still under the swastika. The Allies called it the Colmar Pocket. The German 19th Army held it. Adolf Hitler had ordered that it be held to the last man. Far to the north in the Ardennes forest, Allied forces were finishing off the great German offensive that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The cameras and the headlines were there. The world was watching there. In Alsace, men were dying just as fast, in temperatures just as cold, and no one outside the units fighting there seemed to notice. On New Year's Day, the Germans had launched Operation Nordwind against the American 7th Army in northern Alsace. It was the last major German offensive of the war in the West. It failed, but the Colmar Pocket itself remained, and the soldiers inside it were veteran troops, well dug in and desperate. They knew that if they broke, the Rhine would be next, and after the Rhine, Germany itself. On the 20th of January 1945, General Jacob Devers, commanding the American 6th Army Group, began the operation to eliminate the pocket. The French First Army under General Jean de Latte de Tassigny would lead the assault. The American 3rd Infantry Division, Garlin Conner's division, was attached to support them. The Marne Division was given a sector north of Colmar. Their objective was a small French village called Houssen. The temperature on the morning of January 24th fell to 20 degrees below zero. The 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry had been on the front line for 18 straight days. They slept in foxholes the cold had turned into concrete. 43 of them had been killed or wounded already, picked off by German artillery and snipers in the dark. The Brunwald woods stood ahead of them. Beyond the woods, the Germans waited. At 7 o'clock that morning, First Lieutenant Garlin Conner sat in the battalion command post and worked the maps. This was his job. He was the battalion S2, the intelligence officer. He gathered information. He marked enemy positions. He interrogated prisoners. He briefed the commander. He was not an infantry officer. He did not lead patrols. He did not direct fire. He worked behind the front line. This is the third thing the story turns on. By doctrine, by regulation, by every page of the Army's manual on the duties of a battalion staff officer, Garlin Conner had no business being anywhere near the fighting that morning. He was a man with 5 wound stripes and a still healing hole in his hip. He was a staff officer with more medals than most company commanders. He was already scheduled to be rotated home to Kentucky. He could have stayed at the map table. The Army would have understood. History would have understood. At 7:15, the German artillery opened. The barrage walked across the 3rd Battalion's forward positions in 12 minutes of sustained fury. Shells the size of fence posts ripped through the trees. Frozen trunks exploded into splinters. Earth that had been hard as iron lifted and rained down again as black sleet. Foxholes collapsed. Men screamed. The radio nets filled with the sounds of confusion. At 7:27, the barrage stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, faint at first, then closer, the sound of engines. Heavy engines, tracks grinding through frozen ground. A runner crashed through the door of the command post, breathless, half-frozen, blood on his sleeve. Germans, tanks, 6 of them, infantry behind, coming through the woods toward the left flank. The battalion commander leaned over the map. Around the room, the staff officers waited. If those tanks reached the American foxhole line, the battalion was finished. 6 heavy German vehicles loose among the infantry would not just break the line. They would roll over it. The battalion's machine guns could not hurt them. The battalion's rifles could not hurt them. There were no American tanks in support that morning. There were no tank destroyers in position. The anti-tank guns on the flank could not traverse fast enough to engage. The only weapon in the entire sector that could stop 6 German tanks was the divisional artillery. The artillery was 3 miles behind the front. 12 M2A1 howitzers, 105 millimeters. Enough firepower to break any attack on Earth. But artillery, to be useful, had to be aimed. And artillery at 3 miles distance, firing into a forest, could not aim itself. It needed a forward observer. It needed a man with eyes on the target, who could call the corrections back over a telephone wire. The battalion's forward observation post had been knocked out of action in the opening barrage. The observers could no longer call fire. The wire from that post was severed in a dozen places. From the command post itself, the trees blocked any line of sight. No one in the room could see the German advance. Without a forward observer, the artillery would fire blind. It would land where the maps said the Germans should be, not where they actually were. It would do nothing. Without a forward observer, the battalion was already lost. In the corner of the command post, Garlin Conner set down his coffee cup. He walked to the signal table. He picked up a portable E8 telephone handset. He picked up a hand-carried spool of field wire, 400 yards of it, wound tight. He looped the wire over his shoulder. He looked once at the battalion commander. He did not give a speech. He did not ask for permission. He did not put on more equipment. He had no rifle. He had no helmet liner under his steel pot. He had a still healing wound in his left hip that had begun to bleed again from the cold. He pushed open the door of the command post and walked out into the snow. Outside the door, the world was white and silent and waiting. 400 yards of open ground stretched between him and the front line. Beyond the front line stood the Brunwald Woods. Beyond the woods, 6 German tanks were rolling forward through the trees, and behind those 6 tanks, in formations of squads and platoons and companies, 600 German infantrymen were preparing to deliver the killing blow. The shortest distance between the command post and the place Garlin Conner was about to lie down in the snow was the length of 4 football fields, placed end to end under enemy fire. He started running. The first shell came down at 100 yards. The first shell came down at 100 yards. It hit the snow 40 yards to his left. The blast lifted a column of white into the gray sky. Frozen earth rained down in chunks the size of his fist. He kept running. The second shell came down 20 seconds later, 30 yards to his right. The German artillery observers, somewhere on the high ground east of Houssen, were bracketing him. They had seen a single American figure moving across open snow, and they were correcting their fire. He was a small man in an olive drab field jacket, running through ankle-deep snow, with a spool of telephone wire bouncing on his shoulder and a handset clutched against his chest. He weighed 120 pounds. The wire weighed close to 15 pounds. The wound in his hip had reopened in the cold and was soaking the inside of his trousers. He could feel the warmth of his own blood running down his thigh. He kept running. At 200 yards, a shell struck a tree directly ahead of him. The tree did not fall. The tree exploded. A pine of 40 years standing came apart in a sound like the world cracking open. Splinters the size of bayonets cartwheeled past him through the air. One of them passed close enough to his face that he felt the wind of it on his cheek. He vaulted the smoking stump without breaking stride. The wire spooled out behind him, a thin black line stitched across the snow, his lifeline back to 12 waiting howitzers. At 250 yards, another shell came down 15 yards behind him. The blast wave hit him like a closed fist between the shoulder blades. He stumbled forward 2 steps and caught himself. His ears began to ring with a single high sustained note that would not stop for hours. At 300 yards, he reached the American foxhole line. Men were huddled in their holes, their faces pressed against the frozen wall of the earth, waiting for the German infantry to appear out of the trees. They had heard the engines. They knew what was coming. They saw a single officer they did not recognize sprint past their position with a telephone in his hand. One of them shouted something. Conner did not stop. He did not turn his head. He kept running, past the foxholes, out beyond the last position of his own army, out into the killing ground where no American soldier was supposed to be. 30 yards beyond the American line, he found the ditch. It was an irrigation channel, a drainage cut for the fields that lay between the village and the wood. In summer, it would have carried snowmelt off toward the Ill River. In January of 1945, it was an 18-inch trough of frozen mud and crusted ice, half filled with old snow. 18 inches. A man lying flat in that ditch would still have the upper third of his back exposed above the level of the field. 18 inches would not stop a rifle bullet. 18 inches would not stop a fragment of shell casing. 18 inches would not stop machine gun fire from a tank cupola at 200 yards. But 18 inches would put his eyes just barely below the snow line of the field. It would let him see without being seen. It would give him, for as long as he could stand to lie in it, a window onto the German advance. He went down into the ditch. He pressed his body flat against the frozen mud. He uncoiled the last of the wire. He set the handset against his ear and cranked the magneto. The line clicked. Then a voice came through, distant and tinny but real. The fire direction officer at the artillery battery, 3 miles to the rear. Garlin Conner gave his position. The voice on the other end repeated it back. Conner confirmed. From that moment until the moment 3 hours later, when the last German tank stopped moving, the divisional artillery of the United States 3rd Infantry Division would belong to one man in a ditch. He lifted his eyes above the rim. The first thing he saw was the infantry. They were coming through the trees in proper squad formations, the way veteran soldiers come. 200 yards out, moving by short rushes, one squad up, one squad covering, then alternating, German rifles ready, German helmets dark against the snow. They had done this before. They knew how to do this. He could see the squad leaders making hand signals to their men. Behind the infantry, between the trunks of the pines, he saw the tanks. The official citation, when it was written 6 months later by an officer who had spoken to the survivors, would describe them as Mark VI. Some historians since have wondered whether they were truly Tigers or whether they were the lower-slung assault guns and tank destroyers. The Germans were also fielding in the Colmar Pocket. Conner, lying in that ditch, did not need to know the model number. He could see armor moving through the trees. He could see 4 of them. He believed there were 2 more behind. He could see that they were heavy. He could see that nothing he or any man in his battalion had in his hands was going to stop them. He raised the handset. Fire mission, enemy infantry in the open, 600 meters, adjust fire. He gave the coordinates. The voice on the other end read them back. He confirmed. 3 miles behind him, 12 breaches opened. 12 shells went in. 12 breaches closed. 12 howitzers fired. He counted seconds. The first salvo came in at 40 seconds. He heard it before he saw it. The sound of an artillery shell arriving overhead is a sound men who have heard it never forget. It is a tearing of the sky. The 12 shells came down 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too long. The shells had landed past them, deep in the trees behind the advance, doing nothing to slow them down. This was the moment that mattered. In any artillery shoot, the first correction was the one that decided the rest. If the observer panicked, if he guessed, if he called for a wild swing in the wrong direction, he would waste rounds and let the enemy close to him before he could fix it. Conner did not panic. He had run 400 yards through artillery fire, and his hip was bleeding and his ears were ringing and his hands were shaking from the cold. And he raised the handset and he gave the correction in a voice as flat and level as a man ordering coffee. Drop 100, fire for effect, fire for effect. 3 words that meant every gun in the battery, every round it had on the ground, as fast as the crews could load and fire. The German infantry kept walking forward. They had seen the first salvo land behind them. They believed the Americans were firing blind. They had no reason yet to think anything else. The second salvo came in 18 seconds after the order. This time the shells landed in the middle of them. A 105mm high explosive shell weighs about 33 pounds. The bursting charge inside weighs nearly 5. When it detonates, it sends a wave of overpressure outward at thousands of feet per second, followed instantly by shrapnel of jagged steel traveling almost as fast. 12 of those shells, landing in the same 100 square yards at almost the same moment, do not so much kill as erase. The German formation that had been walking through the trees stopped existing as a formation. Men disappeared. Men were thrown. Men ran. Squad leaders went silent. The neat lines of advance came apart into pieces of men trying to find cover where there was no cover. Trees came down on top of them. The forest floor became a black smoking field of new craters. Conner did not lower the handset. Repeat fire. Same coordinates. 3 miles back, the gun crews of the howitzer battery moved with the economy of men who had been firing those weapons since North Africa. Brass rang on frozen ground. Powder bags went home, shells went home, lanyards came taut. Another salvo, then another, then another. In the ditch, Garlin Conner could feel the impacts through the earth itself. The frozen ground bounced under his ribs with each shell. Smoke began to drift across the field, mixed with the grey light, and the smell of cordite and pine sap and burnt flesh came to him on the cold air. But the infantry, in time, was the smaller of his problems. The tanks were still coming. The tanks had stayed deeper in the trees during the salvos that broke the infantry. They had been waiting. They broke from the tree line 3 minutes after the second salvo had landed, 4 of them in a loose wedge. They moved with the slow, heavy patience of armored vehicles that knew the artillery falling on the infantry was not the artillery that could hurt them. The 105mm shells that were tearing the German foot soldiers apart would have to land directly on top of a tank to do real damage, and at 400 yards, even a perfect observer could not promise that. One of the tanks fired its main gun. The shell crossed the field and struck an American foxhole 300 yards to Conner's right. The hole and the men inside it stopped existing in a single instant. Then a second tank fired, a second foxhole vanished. If the tanks reached the American line, the line was finished. 3 minutes, maybe 4, at the speed they were moving. Conner shifted his fire. He did what he could. He called the artillery onto the moving armor. He aimed for tracks. He aimed for engines. He aimed for the optics on the turret faces. He walked shells in, close to the lead tank, and a shell landed near enough that a track snapped. The vehicle slewed sideways and ground to a stop. He walked the fire onto a second tank, and a shell struck its engine deck, and smoke began to pour out of the rear vents. 2 tanks crippled, 2 still coming. And then, through the smoke and the snow, the other 2 emerged. 6 in total, as the runner had said. The tank commanders had figured out what was happening. They had seen the muzzle flashes of their burning machines. They had seen the gazers of dirt walking across the field in patterns no random fire could produce. They had spotted the thin black line of telephone wire stretched across the snow. They knew, the way armored soldiers always know, that one man somewhere out in front of them was killing them, and they turned toward him. The 4 remaining tanks adjusted their line of advance. The wedge tightened, the gun barrels lowered. They began to drive directly at the position of Lieutenant Garlin Conner. He was alone in an irrigation ditch 18 inches deep, with a telephone and a wire and no rifle. and 4 heavy German tanks were closing on his position at the speed of marching infantry, and behind them, the German foot soldiers were reforming, using the bulk of the armor as moving walls. He picked up the handset. He gave the artillery a new fire mission. He gave them his own coordinates, danger close. In the rear, the fire direction officer, who had been working with him for nearly an hour, stopped. He came back on the line. He asked Conner to confirm. Calling artillery onto your own position was not a thing that was done. The bursting radius of a 105 shell was 50 yards. The wound radius was farther than that. A man who called fire onto his own observation point was a man who had calculated his odds of surviving and decided he preferred them to the odds of running. Conner confirmed. The officer asked him to confirm again. Conner confirmed again. The first shell of that fire mission landed 30 yards in front of him. The blast wave came down the ditch like a freight train. The air pressure changed inside his skull. His lungs emptied against his will. His vision turned white and then gray and then came slowly back. Frozen dirt and shrapnel ripped through the air 6 feet above the rim of the ditch. A man standing at full height inside that ditch would have been shredded in a second. He stayed flat. He kept the handset against his ear. Drop 20. Repeat fire. The next salvo came in 20 yards out. He could feel the heat from the explosions on the skin of his face. Pieces of hot metal hissed into the snow on the edge of his ditch and steamed there. Through the smoke, he could see the lead tank stop. The commander, who had been standing in the cupola, dropped down inside the hull and slammed the hatch. The tank's vision blocks were destroyed. The driver was blind. The vehicle slewed left and rolled into a crater and stopped moving. It did not catch fire. It simply went still, like an animal that has decided not to walk any further. A second tank, behind it, took a direct hit on the turret ring. The shell did not penetrate the armor. It did not have to. The ring jammed. The turret froze in place. From that moment on, the tank could only fire wherever its body happened to be pointed. It became, in the language of armored warfare, a pillbox with treads. The German infantry, however, had rallied. They had taken horrendous casualties in the first salvos, and they had broken, but they had not stayed broken. 200 of them, perhaps more, had reformed in the shelter of the moving tanks. They had used the armor the way veteran soldiers use armor, as walking cover. They had stayed low. They had stayed close, and as the tanks rolled forward toward Conner's ditch, they had rolled forward with them. By the time Conner had finished crippling the second and third tanks, the German infantry that had survived the first artillery had closed to within 100 yards of his position. He could see their faces. He could hear them now, the German officers giving orders in low voices that did not carry, the soft commands of men who knew they were nearly within killing distance. He could hear the bolt actions of their Mauser rifles working. He could hear boots crunching the snow. He shifted the artillery again. He walked the shells across the German skirmishers. He dropped them in walls between himself and the advancing infantry. The forest by then had become something out of an older war, something more medieval than modern, a churned and burning waste where men crawled on their bellies between craters. 40 minutes into the ditch, his assistant arrived. A private from the battalion intelligence section had low-crawled the 400 yards under fire to bring extra wire, a backup handset, and another pair of eyes. He slid into the ditch beside Conner without a word. He was younger than Conner. He looked like most of the boys in the battalion looked, which was very young. He carried his rifle in both hands and watched the flanks, while Conner kept the artillery falling. The two of them lay together in the 18-inch trench while the war happened above them. The cold was past the point where the body could feel it. Conner had been out of the command post for over an hour. The wound in his hip had stopped bleeding because the blood had frozen to the inside of his trousers. His hands had lost feeling. He was working the handset by sense memory now, not touch. A German squad, 8 men, broke from cover at 70 yards and rushed his position. They were trying to close the distance before he could correct fire. They were trying to take the ditch with rifle butts and bayonets. Conner gave the coordinates. The shells came down at 40 yards in front of him. The squad disappeared. A piece of shrapnel struck the private's left leg. It cut through the muscle of his thigh and stopped against the bone. He screamed once, and then he stopped screaming because there was no time and no point. He pressed his hand against the wound. The blood that came out of him hit the snow and turned to red ice almost as it landed. The cold, the unbearable cold, was the thing that saved his life by closing the wound for him. Conner pulled the boy deeper into the ditch. He told him to stay flat. He went back to the handset. Then the German artillery, which had been silent for 40 minutes, began to fire again. This time it was not random. This time it was aimed at him. The German observers, somewhere on the rising ground beyond the wood, had finally found him. They had pinpointed the source of the fire that was destroying their attack. They had marked the position of one American officer in one shallow irrigation ditch, and they had begun to walk their own shells in toward him. 20 yards behind, then 15 yards behind, then 10. In another 2 corrections, the German shells would land directly on top of him. He picked up the handset. He gave the artillery battery new coordinates. This time, the suspected position of the German guns 3 miles away. He requested counter-battery fire. The American howitzers stopped firing on the German infantry, traversed, and began firing on the German artillery instead. For several minutes, the German guns went silent. In those 4 minutes, the German infantry made their last attempt. They came through the smoke that the white phosphorus rounds had laid down across the field. They came in small groups, working forward by crawl and rush. They got to within 30 yards of his ditch. He could no longer see them clearly through the smoke. He could only hear them. The voices of young men in a language he did not understand, speaking quietly in the snow. He estimated their position by sound. He called artillery onto the sound. The shells came in. The voices stopped. 2 hours had passed since he had set down his coffee cup in the command post and walked out into the snow. The last German tank was still rolling, 60 yards from the American line, its main gun firing, its machine guns chattering. The American foxholes were taking casualties. If that tank reached the line would still break. He called for a final concentration. Every gun, maximum rate on the tank. 12 shells arrived in a single second. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there. The armor had held. The armor of a heavy German tank in 1945 could hold against almost anything an American 105mm shell could throw at it. But the vision blocks on the front of the tank were gone, shattered. The driver was blind. The commander in the turret had buttoned up to escape the shrapnel and could see only what his periscope showed him, which by then was smoke. The tank stopped. Just stopped, a blind iron animal sitting in a snowfield. After a long moment, the crew opened the hatches. 5 men climbed out. They began to run for the tree line. American rifles in the foxhole line opened up. 3 of the German tankers went down in the snow. 2 of them made it to the trees. The last operational German tank in the attack on the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry Regiment on the morning of January 24, 1945, came to a stop and was abandoned. In the ditch, Garlin Conner pressed the handset against his ear with hands he could no longer feel and asked the fire direction officer to stand by. The Germans, what was left of them, were beginning to fall back. He was not finished yet. He was not finished yet. The surviving Germans were pulling back through the woods, dragging their wounded behind them, leaving their dead in the snow. A man with a telephone could have let them go. A man who had already done enough for one war could have rolled onto his back and waited for someone to come help him out of the ditch. Garlin Conner kept the artillery falling. He walked the shells across the German line of retreat. He chased them with high explosive. He made sure that the soldiers who survived the morning carried back to their officers the absolute conviction that attacking the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry was not a thing a sane man tried twice. When at last he set the handset down, 3 hours had passed since he had run out of the command post. The wounded private beside him was still alive. The blood had frozen in his trousers. The boy could not stand. Conner pulled him to his feet anyway and put an arm under his shoulder. And the two of them began the long walk back across the 400 yards of cratered ground. The soldiers in the foxholes stood up to watch them come. No one spoke. They looked at the field behind the two men. They looked at the smoking hulks of the German tanks. They looked at the scattered shapes in the snow that had been 600 infantry an hour and a half before. Then they looked at the small Kentucky lieutenant walking back with a private on his shoulder, and they did not have words for what they had seen. The intelligence section went forward later that afternoon. They counted 53 German dead on the ground in front of the ditch. They counted 78 wounded who had been left behind. The estimates of total German casualties for the morning ran past 150. 6 tanks destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned. The 3rd Battalion had lost 11 killed and 23 wounded, most of them in the opening barrage, before Conner ever reached his ditch. After he reached the ditch, American casualties had stopped. The battalion commander sat down that evening and wrote a recommendation. He recommended Garlin Conner for the Medal of Honor of the United States. The recommendation went up through the chain of command. It crossed desks, it collected signatures, it moved up through division, through corps, through army. Somewhere along the way, it was quietly downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross. The reasons were never put on paper. There were quotas, there were politics, there was a war on, and the award system in the European theater in 1945 was a thing run by tired men under pressure. The papers came back, marked DSC. On the 10th of February 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, the commander of the 7th United States Army, came in person to Conner's battalion and pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest. It was the 2nd highest decoration the country could give a soldier. The Medal of Honor citation had been written and rewritten and then signed off as something less. By the time Patch fastened the cross to Conner's field jacket, the words were already buried in a filing cabinet at Army headquarters, the way so many things from that war were buried. Garlin Conner did not complain. He had not asked for the medal in the first place. He took the cross. He saluted the general. He went back to his unit. In March, he was wounded for the 7th and final time. The army decided he had given enough. He was sent home. He sailed from Le Havre. He was honorably discharged on the 22nd of June, 1945. On a Sunday in May, before the discharge papers were signed, the town of Albany, Kentucky, held a parade for him in the courthouse square. They came from every farm in the county. They came on foot and on muleback and in old Ford trucks. The American Legion organized it. The speaker that day was an old man from Pall Mall, Tennessee, 50 miles south, an old man named Alvin C. York, who had once charged a German machine gun nest in the Argonne Forest and brought back 132 prisoners. Alvin York understood what Garlin Conner had done in a way most of the people in the square did not. In the back of a horse-drawn wagon, a 17-year-old girl named Lyda Pauline Wells watched the small lieutenant on the platform. She would marry him that summer. He never told her about the ditch. He told her almost nothing. When she asked him about France, about Italy, about the medals in the cardboard box in the back of the closet, he would look at her with a long, quiet look and say only that he had done what needed to be done, and that was all there was to it. The medals stayed in the box, the Distinguished Service Cross, the 4 silver stars, the Bronze Star, the Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre. He never wore them, he never displayed them. Pauline saw them once, the first year of their marriage, and never again. They moved to a farm on Indian Creek. There was no electricity, there was no running water. They plowed with mules. In the early 1950s, the federal government bought the land out from under them to flood it for Lake Cumberland, and they moved again to a smaller place in the Rowland community of southeastern Clinton County, and they started over. He served 17 years as president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau. He helped his neighbors with their taxes and their crop rotation and their veterans' benefits. He went to church, he raised a son, he grew old. 48 years passed. In the spring of 1996, a stranger drove down the gravel road to the Conner house. His name was Richard Chilton. He was a veteran himself of Korea and of the Gulf War. He had come from Genoa City, Wisconsin, looking for information about his uncle, a private named Gordon W. Roberts, who had died at Anzio in January of 1944. Richard Chilton had been searching for years. He had interviewed more than 300 veterans of the 7th Infantry Regiment, trying to learn what had happened to his uncle's body, his uncle's last hour, his uncle's last words. And in those 300 interviews, again and again, the old men had said one name, Garlin Conner. They had said the name with a kind of awe. Many of them had assumed Conner was long dead. They had told Chilton stories that did not sound like the kind of stories that could be true about one small farmer from Kentucky. They had told him that if Garlin Conner was still alive, he was a man America had forgotten. Chilton came to ask about his uncle. Conner sat with him in the front room. Conner was 77 years old. He had diabetes. He had kidney trouble. He had perhaps 2 years left. He told Chilton about Anzio. He told him that he had known Gordon Roberts. He told him that on the 31st of January, 1944, he had carried Gordon Roberts on his back to a battalion aid station and had stayed with him until he died. For the first time in 52 years, Garlin Conner cried in front of another man. Pauline brought out the cardboard box. She handed it to Chilton. Chilton opened it. He read the citation of the Distinguished Service Cross. He read what Lieutenant Garlin Conner had done on the morning of January 24, 1945, in an irrigation ditch outside a village in Alsace. He looked at Pauline. He looked at Conner. This man, he said, should have received the Medal of Honor. Pauline turned to her husband. Conner was looking back at her with tears in his eyes. After 50 years of silence, he nodded his head. The fight to upgrade the medal began that day. It would take 22 more years. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records denied the first petition in 1997. They denied the appeal in 2000. Garlin Conner died on the 5th of November, 1998. He was 79 years old. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany. The Distinguished Service Cross was buried with the man. Pauline did not stop. She filed again. She wrote letters. A neighbor named Walton Haddix took up the cause. 7 retired generals signed on. The historian Stephen Ambrose wrote about Conner before he died and called what Conner had done that morning far beyond the call of duty. In 2014, an 85-year-old widow filed a federal lawsuit against the United States Army. A judge dismissed the case on the grounds that too much time had passed. She appealed. The case went up. Congress, in time, passed special legislation waiving the time limit. On the 26th of June 2018, Pauline Conner sat in a wheelchair in the East Room of the White House. She was 89 years old. She held the Medal of Honor in her hands. It had taken 73 years and 4 months and 2 days for the United States of America to admit officially what 12 gun crews and 1 battalion of infantry had known by 10 o'clock on a January morning in Alsace. Garlin Murl Conner became the 40th soldier of the 3rd Infantry Division to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in the Second World War. He had been dead for almost 20 years. He had never asked. He had never spoken of it. He had only set down a coffee cup, picked up a telephone, and walked out into the snow.